Welcome to the Shadow Council. Today, the four of us have come together, me, Shane, Gregory, Russell, and Lewis, and we're going to be doing something a bit more topical, a bit more, if you've been paying any attention to the news, you know that there's a major conflict going on in the Middle East with ramifications across the entire planet, particularly me in Australia. We're going to cop it in the neck over here. So we had the idea of talking about lessons from Iran. So this is a very broad way of framing the issue, and I'm really looking forward to hearing how everybody takes this in different directions because Iran is a very ancient place with a very complex history, and its modern history is very interesting as well too. That's what I'm hoping to delve into a bit. But how about I take charge and I'll call people out and we'll come back to me at the end of all of this. So how about we start with Lewis today?
All right. Well, the Iran war is definitely a curveball in some ways. It was one of those things that, may have happened or probably would have happened, but we don't know when. There are so many questions, not only about what will happen, but what led up to it, especially since the revelations with the release of the files over the past few months. We know that there are incredible layers of, I guess, shadowy cabals that are um, deciding a lot of aspects of geopolitics. And I mean, I'm just wondering what what does that have to do with why we went in? What are the ultimate goals behind just, oh, we want to topple the regime? I'm sure that that is certainly one goal, but what are the ulterior motives behind the factions that are really supportive of the Iran war? Another direction we could go in is talking about the potential ramifications, because I am old enough to remember the controversy in the days leading up to the Iraq War. There was a lot of powerful propaganda going on then. A significant number of people supported the Iraq War, and at the time, they weren't necessarily unjustified in doing so, given the information that they had. However, over time and over the years, more and more has come out about uh, what got us into Iraq and how it really was a huge ruse. So I'm not sure how that how this Iran war is going to play out, but we're at a very risky precipice here. So with that, I'm going to throw the ball over to Russ.
Okay. So yeah, so I'm gonna take this topic broadly, but in a true direction. Um, and that is to say, and we decided for an informal theme. So I'm laying down and having my thought process. We all showed up in varying degrees of outfits for the day. We didn't know if we should coordinate or just kind of go for an authentic theme. So this is what you get. For those that are on premium and watching the video and not just listening to the cast today. But all right, so join me in my musings as I look to the ceiling and think and speak. So the thing about Iran, as well as most modern political uh, newsworthy items that are covered, the amount of distortion from a dozenish different motivated interests. And that is from propaganda to this new information highway that exists that Iranian leaders are capable, to the extent that they can trust what's coming out of our president's mouth, or vice versa. To what extent is what Iran is saying about X, Y, or Z just, propaganda, or their version of letting the world see a side of them that's strategic in its own right. In this age of information, the war is in the words, which is why it's so good to focus on truth and epistemics, especially when it comes to that sort of thing. So that way you aren't deceived by rhetoric and fallacy and the like. You know, skepticism is healthy. So, given that I make most of my real weighted decisions that I care about with emotions, um, I use, my neo method, or my new epistemic ontology. And so, generally speaking, since we can never be 100% sure of anything, that means that we have to approach everything with confidence ratings, or CRs, and we create a map. That kind of delineates that confidence rating based on every decision. So every decision that I make, whether I go left or right, or whether or not I'm going to behave as though my car is going to start whenever I get into it, for the day, right? That the car thing is usually better than 99% confidence rating, right? Uh, and so I get emotionally attached more whenever I can actually know what the heck I'm talking about. So there are so many factors, from the strategic to the tactical to the corporate interests. You see, there's so many different parties. I can't even track them all, right? That, because of the nature of people being able to monopolize on this thing or that, and then subvert or monopolize another company. I mean, it's beautifully, uh, it beautifully captures the human competitive instincts, and gets all of that pointed in directions that are not guns at one another's heads. So, one thing that I can say is, at least global conflict is down to a fraction of a percentage of the overall population that was once the case in something like World War One. Right? Instead, we all just watch it, and then we partake in the proxy war of information and what side we want to. It's kind of like a football game, like a Super Bowl, right? Like, we can all wear shirts for what side a team we think is going to win, and eat nachos and chips, and then we can post to our social media about what team we're on, and how much we want to win. So, the percentage of people doing that rather than getting trench foot is a massive step in the right direction. However, uh it's hard for me to speak at all about Iran, because my confidence rating's probably lower than a 70% about any given decision. Now, if I was given a branching tree, something like, if X were true, then what do you think Iran should do in this case? Then I can make better, I can talk about it a little easier, but it's speculation on top of theoretical. And so, to be honest with this topic, I think I was probably, until Shane told me, because at first I was kind of anti the topic because of this reason that I just told you. And then I said, Shane, if I end up doing that, I'm just going to talk about how hard it is for me to speak about anything that's going on in Iran. I've never even seen it. For all I know, it doesn't exist. Right. So, much like Santa Claus in the North Pole, I have no idea. Um, it looks like pretty wild. Looks like Tatooine, but I don't know, right? All I have are the images that are passed around. And anyway, so yeah, I think I wanted to speak to the information war as well as healthy skepticism, especially when it comes to all of the emotional connection that we're getting with these back and forths between different political uh, groups and subgroups, and really kind of, I'd like to be able to direct that energy um, to places that we can be anchored in and work from. I'm not saying that all that is a waste of time, and um, I'm sure that there's things that I don't really want to have to steel man that position right now. But I'm not saying it's a complete waste of time. I'm also not saying that it isn't, because I haven't been able to think about it because we don't have time for that. But just ground yourself in, what do I know? Anytime you're confused, anytime things are getting out of hand, anytime you're like, why is half of the population crazy? Because there's no way, right? It just means that half of the population is either crazy or less informed. Um, so I would say ground yourself in what you know, work on what you can change, and be emotionally invested in those things. And then everything else coming down the pipeline until it affects you um, in a meaningful way, I would say, treat it like a theoretical exercise in information warfare and some sort of tactical game you can play, at dinner with your family or friends. So yeah, maybe a weird take on it. I'm not sure, but definitely a meta take, and kind of the way that I'm approaching everything that I just mentioned is the way that I'm approaching this Iran conflict in my daily life. So I guess we'll throw it over to Gregory. You have the ball. Cha-ching.
And I intercepted the ball. Greetings, salutations. There's two bullet points I have. The first one's historical. The second one would be after Shane's turn. The first one, with the historical one, I'll be elaborating on Lewis, the Tiger himself, how he had his experience with the Iranian war in the late 80s, 90s, and early 2000s. But people misremember that there was a larger conflict and strife in the 1800s. It was a prelude to the Cold War. Well, a first Cold War named the Great Game between the Russian Empire, British, and French Empire, where as the Russian Empire was descending her territory south to the Middle East, absorbing the majority of the Caspian and Red Sea, the English and French Empire had an alliance with the Ottoman Empire, which Iran was among that empire, and saw the descending threat, both economical, territorial, and political, including religious threat, and a future hazard. The seizing point was when Afghanistan became neutral. And from that neutrality of Afghanistan, it continued this culmination of who can descend northern and southern in the points of territory. After World War I, the dissolution of 3 or 4 empires happened: Russian, Ottoman, German, and the Austro-Hungarian. Left free territory for liberation and independence. One example, Poland, before being consumed again in 1939. But with Iran, it was having its personal turmoil, both economically and politically, after the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire, or the Grandpa Empire, as it was nicknamed, which if you remember some of the audience and plausibly two of the brothers here, the Arab Springs. This was a socialist attempt on the Middle East area to assume power. And from that assumption, that accumulation of power happened in the name of tyranny, and then a democracy entered. That if you hear of the Operation Ajax, which became a blunder due to President Eisenhower, the Democratic Republic of Iran became superseded with the Shah, or the prince slash king. Then that was superseded with an Islamic autocratic ruler, Anatolia Khomeini, till 1989, and his successor, which was recently assassinated. And from that assassination, it's affecting not solely the United States economy, it's affecting international economy. That is my historical point. You're next, Shane.
Brilliant background. I can leap off that. So, couple of background points. I've done a lot of tutoring in my life, and I've tutored quite a lot of Persian or Iranian people. I think they're amazing. I love them so much. They're really wonderful people. So seeing this kind of conflict blow up is a bit tragic. And I want to briefly make just a point going back to the Iraq War as a contrast, at least in the Western approach to it. You people may not remember, but with the Iraq War, we had the biggest anti-war protests in like human history in the West. They were just everywhere. They were huge, and they were completely ignored. Like the governments were just like, it's already basically baked in the cake. So and contrast that with the Iran War. Nobody really saw it coming. It was already happening by the time we knew it was going to happen. And the protests have been very minimal. I think there's been a change in the West where we basically realize that protests don't, well, at least organic protests don't achieve anything anymore. So I think a lot of people who previously would have protested in past generations nowadays don't even bother. I think the whole idea of protests, we just think of it as an astroturfed kind of fake thing that you see on the news, and nobody wants to kind of associate with that anymore. So that's an interesting change. But getting back to Iran, I think it's one of the best case studies of cultural schismogenesis because the current Iranian regime is quite extreme in the way that it's held together culturally. But that is a creation of history, and the West has had a big hand in getting them to that point. So, as Gregory was saying, there's been a few major changes in. Oh, sorry. You want to interject? Yes, Lewis?
Oh, yeah, quick thing. Could you go over a brief definition of schismogenesis, just in case someone hasn't heard it?
Good point. Good point. Yeah, it is a kind of obscure term. So, cultural schismogenesis is when you have two groups of people that are aware of each other enough that they tend to make their own culture the opposite of the other group. So, a really good example of this was the Nazis and the Soviets. So the Nazis started going down the path of genetic determinism, that like everything is inheritable that's important about a person, and they took that to like more and more ridiculous, monstrous extremes. The Soviets had the opposite view that anybody could be like retrained into anything. They were absolute blank slatists, and they like manipulated their biological science to deny the existence of any heritable elements. Like they had weird theories that like you could transform barley into wheat just by growing it under different circumstances, and all sorts of other interesting things that didn't match the data at all. But anyway, the reality is more complex. It's a combination of both those factors, but the cultural dynamic between those two powers led them down a narrow opposite path. And I think something very similar has happened in Iran. So Iran became somewhat independent, tried to nationalize its oil resources, which pissed off the British, which got the US on the case basically to topple their power structure and put a puppet government in. Now, during the time that puppet government was in, you might have seen images of like women in like miniskirts and beehives walking down the streets of Tehran. And that did happen, but it was kind of an artificially induced rapid westernization of a very ancient and very cohesive culture. Like the Persians have been around a very long time and they understand who they are. So while that forced westernization, modernization was happening, this resentment was building up among a large silent majority of the people, so that when there was the pushback finally came, it went extremely in the other direction and kind of opened the doors for a really militant and narrow interpretation of Islam to become like the operating system of that culture to kind of keep it together and define it as being different from the West. Whereas up until that point, Islam in Persia and Iran hadn't been particularly extreme. They were kind of like they kind of just went along with Islam to avoid getting in too much trouble with the Ottoman Empire. So yeah, it's a really interesting case in how if you push people in one direction, you can expect to have the pendulum swim back in the other direction more violently if you lose control of that cultural narrative. And we have a modern example of that happening in the West right now. The last, I don't know, 10 years, we've become pressured to become more culturally progressive, perhaps than we were comfortable with doing. The woke movement kind of reached its peak maybe 3 or 4 years ago, where yeah, things that would previously have just been maybe arguable became controversial or toxic in professional and political environments. And now we're seeing that pendulum swing back in the other direction, and it's going to be interesting to see how far it goes. Oh, and one other thing that's really interesting about the Persian people, um, when the Shah of Iran was leading up to being overthrown by local resistance forces, he had a harder and harder time paying skilled people to like serve on his government. There's this record that he had to like give people ridiculous amounts of money to be like his ministers and to work in the bureaucracy. And like the Chinese write about the art of war, like how to make the most use of limited force and opportunities under difficult circumstances. Like they wrote a book about it. Though I think Lao Tzu wasn't actually a particularly good general. There's a bit of interesting real history behind that. But I think the Persians actually know how to do that stuff intuitively. They are very good at picking their time and their position in the geopolitical landscape so that they can punch well above their weight, which makes me concerned that this conflict could drag on for a very long time and that it might actually be a trap where the US gets sucked into committing more and more resources and forces until it becomes, even worse than the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. I'm not entirely convinced that the US political system and military has fully learnt the lessons of what happened in those two recent conflicts. So yeah, that's kind of my broad perspective on things. So I'll throw it over if anyone wants to jump in. We've got like another 20 minutes or so.
So I
I
wanted
will.
to butt in here and say that uh, basically, what do you think will happen if there is some sort of regime change? If the Trump administration gets their wish and the Iranian people decide to put in a pro-US, more secular government, how will the other major geopolitical rivals, such as China and Russia, react? Because their main support for Iran, as I understand it, comes about because they're all kind of generally opposed to U.S. hegemony. And basically, would they sit back and take it, or would they try and do some other form of sabotage, or would they be completely cowed into submission? Unlikely, but a possibility. Anyone have an opinion on that?
I do. And that is dependent on how the motive of civilization is used for. In that sense, from how the United States and its animosity with the East and Far East and Asia, they've decided to prolong this war that the British and French have in previous decades, if not centuries, couldn't understand the utility of civilization and the direction of how they're misunderstanding civilization is progressing to a form of conformity that is emptying existence and devoiding it of value. In this to the secular sense of how the markets would be involved from the China perspective, from the Russian perspective, and civilization collapsing to a archonic style of warfare in the Middle East that will continue till there's no redemption, if not nothing to reverse the process. And that is from how the view of a utilitarian long-term pursuit is to ensure a form of pleasure that will distract, but it's an emptying distraction in a secularized society where we can't transcend values. Now, here is my controversial part, if not controversial already, is how one should define power to seize the power in Iran. The defined power is the ability to strive, expand, growth, and exert oneself through turmoil or struggle, which is a natural condition, if not an innocent natural condition of humans. Now, whom is willing to use that same definition? I say it's what the evil spirits or the harmful individuals who are useful for that preservation of that species to nurture that instinct for human survival, including if their methods are as seen on the surface level and how artificial morality is today, or a set of value judgments. It doesn't matter if their methods are amoral and sadistic. And that these evil spirits will prevail from pushing forward, challenging the established norms in the East, and fostering innovation, while reawakening the passions that have slept for centuries. And that's how the rise and fall of the misunderstanding of civilization, it continues this pattern, cyclical pattern of weaker forces being capitalized on from even weaker forces in the sense of bullying. And another point for this controversial, and I say in air quotes as satire, that to challenge the idea of society, one has to establish a form of exploitation and slavery. A slavery system does guide to an economic collapse, but it's highlighting a complex, interdependent institution of how society is establishing itself onto itself before someone decides to combat reactively to the filth on the throne. But isn't there filth on the throne already from people devouring themselves and their stomachs are satiated and overflowing because they've devoured the whole structure itself, including themselves? That's my perspective. And it differs from 20th century movements of fascism that was generated from mass democratic energy and and unnecessary use of technology, as Shane highlighted with the Soviet Nazi complex of eugenics.
I'm pretty skeptical the US is even going to attempt to install a specific leader. I mean, they could barely control Kabul. Like Afghanistan is much smaller but than Iran, and yeah, they could barely keep a puppet propped up in Kabul for what was it, a decade? They tried to do that, but the rural hinterlands were basically a Wild West Badlands. Yeah, Iran has probably more impressive geography, and it's a much bigger population, and it's much more organized population. And there is a significant resistance in the nation to the current regime, but there's also probably a much larger uh, subset of the population that fervently support and have fully absorbed the idea that the West is evil and coming to do great harm to them. So that message has been very easy, I think, for the current regime to sell to the people of Iran over the last 30 years, I think things have been building up.
I will jump in real quick and kind of contrasting. So, with everything in mind that I said in my last bit about not being able to trust anything due to the information war here. That being said, I still think it's worth having a picture of the situation and just not really like being willing to listen to all new information and change one's to not get too emotionally attached to any really side or piece of data just because of how fluid it is and how little we can trust it.
Mm.
But what I will say though is so again, having said all of that, with my 70% confidence rating, if somebody paid me to give me your, do your best and give me an assessment here of some, the geopolitical kind of situation, especially in relation to what all of you just said, I would say that the Iranian regime is at odds with the majority of the Persian population. I think that the Persian population at large, and no one's, by the way, mentioned, I think, the elephant in the room, which is the Sunni Shia political lines that are at play. I think for the what we see, where Shane said that the Persian mentality is to know their time and take it. I happen to think that what we're seeing is that happening, but in a way to excise an even more ancient enemy than the U.S. I think that, and why? Why did this happen? China. I think that Iran is fighting, so the Iranian regime is not using Persian tactics. They've been backed up by Chinese tactics and Chinese equipment that we have now. So what's happening in China, which is to say mass purge, again, all of this could be 70% confidence rating, but we're seeing mass purge. We're seeing vast reorganization. We're seeing like moves from China that we have, well, from the CCP that we haven't seen. I mean, this is a total change from what they were doing, how hot they were talking, their wolf warrior diplomacy. They were misinformed, and and that misinformation that came from within, they informed their allies about, and they needed certain things to play out for their own ambitions. Now, and I think that really this is a Chinese scheme that we're seeing kind of play out. And by China, again, the CCP is what I'm talking about. The vast overinvestment, like the amount of funding that went into that regime, as well as Venezuela. And well, we'll just keep it there. The amount of funding that went in there from the Chinese as a in the shadows and in the dark was substantial. And none of that, they wouldn't have made those investments if this was part of the plan. Too many of those things have been lost. and then there's been too much. There's always the in the background. I wonder, oh, how much of this could be planned? How much are we being deceived? How much is it a trap to get the U.S. stuck in a war? I think that the Chinese response has been the most telling piece of evidence, to 70% confidence rating, of how the war in Iran is actually going. I think if we look at China, we can learn more, because that regime was propped up
Mm.
by, in all the modern ways that it was, by a lot of Chinese promises and equipment, um, and Belt and Road initiatives. And honestly, the fact that China wanted that to get bogged down, as well as they thought Ukraine would be over in 3 days, for their own ambitions for Taiwan, which is what I think Xi's ambitions for Taiwan, which I think he's coming to realize now. I think he's pivoting. I think now he's trying to consolidate power. I think he's very scared. I think he's going to give up offensive ambitions for Taiwan, especially with the moves that have been made recently from the West, and Japan. And so I think that, and the fact that, I don't know, to me, that the Persian maneuver was seeing all of this happen, them realizing it, and then together. I mean, how often has, I mean, for a long time, Saudi Arabia has and the other nations, from Oman to the UAE to I don't want to get into the whole geopolitical every line of going on there, but if you really want to, like, crudely break this down, you can say, the pseudo faction leader was the Iranian regime on one side of the Persian world there, and on the other it would be the Saudi prince and his counselors. And the thing is what Saudi Arabia just, was for the most part backed up by a lot more Western equipment, deals, money, etc., even leaning into ideologies. And the Iranian regime leaned the other way towards the east. And so this is all these larger players. And if we look at how kind of the US's momentum versus the Chinese momentum, I think that's the things to look at. And I think honestly, the craziest piece was the larger kind of Persian pseudo de facto alliance. I don't know if you call it that, but it's certainly all of them at once making turning in on the moment to seemingly excise in a way that's much more direct than they normally would involve themselves in. So I don't know, maybe that's longer than I wanted to be to explain all of that, but that's what I see from, like, this information war, proxy war, going on here, and kind of how this kind of all trickle down tactical strategic economics plays out from my command throne inside of my bedroom over there in the U.S. in Western North Carolina. The
Hey,
end.
I've got a fun theory. What if the crippling of the oil and gas infrastructure in the Persian Gulf is actually not necessarily something that the US didn't want, because that oil and gas mostly supports Europe and Japan and China. The US is pretty much operating in the Western Hemisphere, particularly if it's going to open up Venezuela to oil production in the near future, maybe it actually is a beggar thy neighbor kind of strategy that as long as the US comes out of this relatively clean and China is crippled, Japan struggles to remilitarize, and Europe sinks into irrelevancy because they're all running out of critical resources from the Middle East. Maybe that's the best possible consequence. And you just leave Israel behind basically as the police station for that region.
I think it was intentional. Again, the larger China, the CCP, you got to focus on that CCP versus U.S. connection,
Hmm.
and the order of Venezuela. We drill, baby, drill, and it really is like kind of dominoes at work here. I really think that this was, and all before the meeting with Xi that he just delayed, that's supposed to take place in a couple of weeks. I mean, this is like he wanted all this done before he sits in a room with the man, right? And you see, and he's scrambling, right? He's there's never been so much wildness coming out of I guess what I would say is like I can kind of tell what's happening more, and that's really rare with China, right? Normally they aren't very transparent, but the fact that they have like there's so you catch somebody in a lie that you can be sure about whenever they do something that shoots themselves in the foot, and you're like, well, they definitely wouldn't have done that on purpose, right? Like
Hmm.
that's clearly a mess up, right? I can see that. And so when you see things like, and we've seen a couple of them both in Venezuela and Iran. I Trump probably did it on purpose, but there was like a delegation that had left from like the Chinese, like you within like 24 hours of making like a new deal, and they're promising them it's going to be great. We got your back. We got your back. Only to like crush the leadership within 24 hours of those delegations meeting. And of course, China for the longest time has said that has maintained an air of, oh, well, we don't do X, Y, and Z. We sell them military equipment, but then they also like sell them the people that operate it, so that way they can teach their people how to do it. So there's actually like Chinese intelligence in, I guarantee you there's been Chinese officers killed in Iran, but nobody's going to tell you anything about that. So yeah, I think that this whole all the oil plays already happened. He even said something like, "I encourage." This is such a troll. He says, "I encourage the CCP should get out here and send some ships to help protect the strait." Right? I mean, he did that on purpose, right? Because it's China that has the oil problem now, right? Not the U.S.
Oh, so also another thing, Russ, you mentioned elephants in rooms, and Shane, you mentioned Israel. And I think that is another potential elephant in the room because Israel has the potential to benefit from this war, but not necessarily. It is a huge gambit that the leaders are taking, and people are asking as well, like, how much of this war was decided by people in America, by the American politicians, and how much of it was decided by external forces. And those external forces, I mean, some people are pointing at Israel, but you can also ask whether Israel itself is a player or a puppet or somewhere in between of I guess, some other shadowy organization or power. It's one of those things where you're basically in speculation mode.
I'm also really curious about the potential of this new decapitation policy and technology. Like they did one version of it in Venezuela where they just grabbed the leader and took him away. And in Iran, that wasn't an option, so they just blew him up. And then the next person stepped in and they blew them up straight away. Like, what is geopolitics like if one player has the ability to just repeatedly decapitate rivals like that?
Yeah,
Do you
server
end up,
admin.
well, do you just end up with a political structure that doesn't have any recognizable head?
There's a reason that through history, leaders have generally not tried to assassinate and decapitate each other, at least when they are of relatively even powers. And that's because if one side does it, then the other side can do it, and it becomes really bad for the leaders and especially the ruling class. But I'm wondering how much the assassination attempts on Trump have affected his decisions to go after the leaders of Venezuela and now Iran. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if they had potentially sent, I guess, missions against him out. So,
Well, it opens
basically,
up the field for asymmetric warfare. Like there's drones and like there's a whole lot of new things that are kind of technologies in the margins that China definitely, and by proxy probably Iran, have access to, that are small enough and lightweight enough that could be smuggled into the US territory and used in really creative ways that haven't been done before. That could be something really interesting. Like what if Trump gets assassinated by like a micro drone?
I think that
Speaking,
I do think that they've already tried these things, and they've probably tried that thing too. It's just they got stopped at the border and we never heard it. You know, they didn't. They're not going to say, "Oh, well, this one we were going to send to Trump if you let it through the, you know, like if it didn't get through all the scanning equipment, right? This one was going to be for him." So, you know, instead, what they get is like, what are you doing? You have like you have this drone and the components to make explosives, and they go, I don't know, it was a project for my school project, right? It's like, and that's it. It's like that's it. That's there. But there's been some really crazy attempts. I don't know if you know, the craziest one I've heard was two. Uh, I think they were some sort of biologist. I want to say it was a fungus, and they smuggled it in, and it was something that maybe it was a virus, right? But I want to say it was weirder than that. Like it might have been a fungus. I can't remember. Maybe it was like a plant disease that I
I
can't
think I
remember.
remember that. It
This
was
is
a wheat stem rust.
Right. And they caught him.
Mm.
And it was like very like sneaky. Like these guys were married, right? But clearly like like agents of the CCP, because they got their texts, and the texts were like basically, I think it was almost verbatim something like, just one more job, babe, and then we're done for good. So there have been some extremely creative like attempts to do that, to do, not to mention the direct assassination attempts at Trump. I actually think what Lewis said is very interesting. I hadn't considered that angle, but after the three or four that we know of, right, and however many others, who knows? I would love to see the world like it would. Oh God, how cool would it be if we could just like, I want a simulation, but they never tried to kill Trump directly, right? Like, what does the world look like now?
uh, whilst elimination, execution, assassination, and decapitation is relevant, the major bureaucratic countries are executing themselves from how they're investing in the oil embargo in the Middle East. What Shane was describing earlier of Japan descending to a low form of commodity and material use is similar to pre-World War One, where they were an isolated country that were desperate for colonization and materialism, similar with the United States. They became neutral and, to a degree, irrelevant before and during till the final year of World War One. And that's the similar echoing effect today, where the United States is pushing itself to being assertive, and now it's neutral and being irrelevant again. So this is slow patterns to how pre-World War One happened, including the economic dependency on oil embargo in the Middle East, and now the Caribbean islands are involving themselves in how we've had animosity with Caribbean islands of Cuba, Venezuela, and and at times Mexico.
Now, also, I'm wondering, after assuming that this stuff in Iran ends in some way, positive, negative, or neutral, how that will affect the new Don Roe doctrine, which may be coming out, where the U.S. is going to try and concentrate more on its own continents, its own hemisphere, and kind of let Europe and Asia and Africa do their own stuff.
Here's my prediction. If that withdrawal to the Western Hemisphere happens, and there's any remaining industrial power in China and its allies, they would potentially support the Mexican cartels in causing all sorts of trouble on the southern border and pushing into the US. There's an enormous vulnerability there.
Well, yeah, I mean, I do think they have traced back all that fentanyl to the labs over, coming out of the CCP ports, right? So clearly they've already done a lot of that, right? So I now they're not. I really think, by the way, that was personal, right? Because of the opium from 300 years ago that just took them out, man. They wanted to like have like a poetic, like, you know what I mean? So they really wanted to bring that back around. But it was, I guess they were probably too obvious about it, or I guess actually the problem they ran into is when we introduced opium to them, they didn't have opium. When they introduced fentanyl to us, and we got meth, we got hair, we got all kinds of stuff going on.
Just
You
throw it
know,
on the pile over there.
we have immunity to that form of warfare. Right? That's in our blood.
Man, this 60s and 70s hippies would adore fentanyl today.
Yeah. Hey, you hit us with the downers, we got the meth heads to fight you. You hit us with the uppers, we'll send the downers after you.
Oh, geez. Hey, we're getting pretty close to the hour. Do you think that's about time to put a pin in it? I think we've had a really interesting conversation.
Yeah, I think this was interesting. It is also a little bit like I was worried about. It's just like, how do we chip away at this monolith of a piece of entertainment? It's there's just there's so many, and each separation is every step back of like, well, maybe that's a lie. Well, maybe that's a lie, and then there's just this whole new picture that you have to, like, you change one factor, and now the whole geopolitical climate could be different, right? And then you reassess everything looking at that map, right? So it's tough to say anything definitively, but there's a lot of good, I guess, wargaming, or what would you call this? Like speculative
Armchair
entertainment.
admiraling. We're being armchair admirals.
Maybe that's the trick. The trick is that you have to do it for fun, and you have to know what you're doing, right? So it's like, we know that nothing we say here is going to change that environment, right? But we're having fun with it. And maybe we're playing some like predictive, like again, like, oh no, I think the Panthers are going to win. Oh, maybe we're doing something like that. But I do think that our telos is kind of like entertainment. Let's see what happens, right? Like, I think, and and maybe some higher forms of like something going on there, strategic thinking. But really, I think you just have to have your head right about it, because it stinks to see people get their cortisol, and it's just, I see it all over my feeds, and I just shut the feeds off, man.
Mm.
You got to stay in the lane. You got to know what you're doing. That's my outro.
Should we make a commitment to come back and revisit the topic if and when the war is officially over?
Yeah, that'd be
Yes.
fun. That'll be fun. And then, yeah, then we'll yeah, that'll be fun.
Because often when these things drop out of the news cycle, people just kind of forget about it. And I think we're above that. We actually want to look back at
Definitely.
our positions and
Yeah.
our analysis and our predictions and see how they
Yeah.
played out.
Our post game, and I'll make up a point system somehow. That way we can figure out who won.
Brilliant.
A,
Brilliant.
a post game speech of fuck both sides. I want Antarctica to win.
Do you want to sign us out,
As long as
Gregory? Oh, no, Lewis.
as long as it's post game and not post World War III, you know.
Post-apocalypse.
Isn't war a game too? Nevertheless,
And
amor fati.
yes,
Amor fati,
Amor
friends.
Fati.
All right. Bye bye.